For the final part of the afternoon, we're going to hear from the co-founder of Compass Pathways, Ekaterina Malievskaia, who I've been working with for a year, 18 months, I'd say. And has played a pivotal role actually in the development of psilocybin. And the thing that Compass has done, which no one else has done, is they've created capsules of psilocybin with matching placebo capsules that we can use for these trials that we place so much relevance upon, but without which we cannot, with a health-related argument, challenge Schedule 1 designation. So, like it or not, Compass has been hugely important for me, and I think will prove to be hugely important in this process. After Katia has finished speaking, we'll invite everyone who's spoken this afternoon, and Alan, who's here, for a final plenary panel discussion to sort of bring it all together. At that point, there'll be some closing remarks, and then we will move back out into the atrium where there will be a drinks reception and a piano recital from a very talented friend of mine. So I'll hand over to Katia now. Are you all ready?
Yes.
Yeah, and thanks for coming.
Is this thing on?
Yeah.
Hello. Hi everyone. My name is Ekaterina Malievskaia. I'm a co-founder of Compass, along with two other co-founders, Lars Wilder and my husband George Goldsmith. I'm a physician by training. I was a faculty in internal medicine at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. I was in private practice and academic medicine for many years in New York. I was a private intensivist for a multi-specialty group. I'm not a psychiatrist, not a neuroscientist. And my co-founders, Lars Wilder is a successful entrepreneur who built several businesses, one of them in healthcare, and my other co-founder, George Goldsmith, who is also my husband, is a serial entrepreneur, and in his past professional life, he worked on large-scale social problems, including multi-stakeholder collaborations, and what happens when the public goods are created by private companies. So he largely worked on the intersection of public-private collaboration, and part of his work involves collaboration with European Medicines Agency and several large pharmaceutical companies, and trying to ask the question and answer the question, most importantly, what happens, how do we get the right medicine to the right patient at the right time, at the cost that society can afford? And as a result of this work, his company created a product that became one of the most successful products in the history of EMA, and one that is most widely used, called parallel scientific advice. That is when the drug development is guided, early drug development is guided not only by regulators but by payers. So we all came together for personal reasons. And some of you might know that Compass was created when we struggled to find solutions, treatments and effective solutions for my son who suffered from depression and OCD. And nothing in my professional life prepared me to the helplessness and hopelessness that I've seen in psychiatry when my son became ill and when I was on receiving end of the care. So because of that, and I guess one thing I want to mention, that it was not a case of a boy cured by magic mushrooms. It was a kind of like a stock market. It was ups and downs, and a lot of work went into it, but the trend was overall positive. So a lot of effort went into it, and a lot of things needed to come together to create a positive outcome for this one person. And in this journey, I was always aware that we were just fortunate, and we could take the time and resources to create this positive outcome, but there were a lot of families who possibly could not do that for their children or their loved ones. So the Compass was created to accelerate, if I can make it work, to accelerate patients' access to innovation in mental health. I think it's very important to note that we're not a psychedelic company, we're not a mushroom company. We are in the business of changing patients' experience with mental health. We just happen to think that psilocybin is one of the most promising innovations currently in psychiatry. Let's see. So I think the key word in our mission is access. So access is complex. Let's talk about access. And this is just kind of little bits and pieces that constitute access that we try to untangle at Compass. So in the next 20 minutes or so, we'll be talking about what does it take to create access for patients who currently don't have any available options. So what does it take to make psilocybin into medicine? It takes regulatory approvals and clinical trials. We need the drug. We need to, how do we make it available and how do we make it affordable? If we are to, if we think that psilocybin and MDMA in fact offer something that is of clinical significance, then I think it's really important to understand the path to patients. So all research, not necessarily the big pharma, small pharma, tiny pharma research can be focused on this, but also all researchers understand and how we harmonize research in order to accelerate approvals of these treatments for patients who don't have any other options. So that's our, let's talk about access. That's the first one. So in our first conversation with the European Medicines Agency, the regulators told us that if the regulatory agency to put public resources into reviewing an application for new medicine, we need to demonstrate three things. One is we need to be able to demonstrate that we have the drug and we can manufacture it and manufacture it at scale and continue improving the efficacy and cost of manufacturing while maintaining the highest standards, highest quality standards. The second part was to do the regulatory, to do the clinical trials in a particular patient population according to the standards that regulators need to see. So we often hear from psychedelic researchers or psychedelic diehards that I at least often hear that we know that the medicine works. Actually, what we know is that psychedelics produce meaningful, profound, and sometimes transformational personal experiences. What we don't know if these experiences actually translate into clinical outcomes that are meaningful for the regulators. So for that reason, we have to do the clinical trials. We have to focus on a particular patient population that needs to be homogeneous, and it needs to be a significant unmet need for the regulators to consider this. So that's the third part. And the fourth part is, in case of psilocybin, we needed to demonstrate that we can train a high number of therapists who are capable and competent of administering these treatments to patients. So, let's see. Yeah, so if we, what are we doing here? So to start on this path, first of all, we needed a drug. So when in 2016, when in 2016 we were unable to source GMP psilocybin for our small project on the Isle of Man, our board said, well, you have to manufacture it yourself. And we said, sure, how hard could it be? Actually, it turned out to be really, really hard. I want to be clear that our psilocybin is a synthetic psilocybin. It's not an extract. It's not natural magic mushrooms. It's a chemical. It's a chemical analog of psilocybin. So there was a paper published by Japanese researchers that synthesized 10 grams of psilocybin and declared victory. We've tried that process and it failed to produce significant amount at scale. So in the process of manufacturing at scale, and the first 2 batches were over half a kilo, we solved about 60 different technical problems. And that constituted our manufacturing patent. Then in the path to continue improving the manufacturing of psilocybin, that includes formulation as well, we at the moment transitioning to a different formulation. So the first piece of work cost about 700,000 pounds. And we now at the second phase of manufacturing and formulation of synthetic psilocybin. What previously took us, not us, but took about 4 weeks and a small team in Tyvek suits, the same amount now is being produced in essentially an automated way in 2 hours. So that significantly affects the price of the of synthetic psilocybin, which hopefully eventually will be translated into drug price. So I guess what I needed to say maybe in the beginning is that what gets tested in clinical trials and what gets eventually approved is what's called investigational medicinal product. And investigational medicinal product is not just a chemical compound, contrary to the popular belief. It actually a complex entity that includes chemical, includes the manufacturing recipe, includes preclinical and toxicology data, and then subsequently all the clinical safety and efficacy data that was collected in the process of clinical trials or other studies. So once this is done, once we have psilocybin, we move towards the clinical trials. And in the clinical trials, I want to emphasize that early and frequent regulatory conversations are essential. Our first scientific advice, parallel scientific advice that we had in 2016 included not only representatives from 26 member states of Europe, European member states, but also pairs from 4 or 5 different countries. And here is the, at that time we proposed psilocybin for treatment of existential distress in cancer patients. This is the response from NICE. As you know, NICE is National Institute of Clinical Excellence. And their assessment was that psilocybin holds clinical potential. And they would be very interested in developing psilocybin further, just not for the indication of existential distress. They thought, and actually all the regulators and payers thought that indication was too small. They encouraged us to focus on a larger indication of treatment-resistant depression based on a pilot done by Robin. And it really changed the course that our company took. But going back. So we subsequently had parallel scientific another scientific advice that shaped our protocol the way it looks right now, and the same protocol it eventually received a breakthrough therapy designation from FDA. And breakthrough therapy designation is an interesting product. Essentially, FDA admits or accepts that psilocybin has probably demonstrates signals of superior efficacy for patients with treatment-resistant depression as compared to current treatments. So because of that, the agency is prepared to put resources behind accelerated review of all the data and is committed to grant us any meetings and answer any questions that we might have in the process of developing psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. It doesn't happen very often. The other two drugs that receive breakthrough therapy designation are esketamine, that just received approval from the advisory board of FDA. And the other one is Sage 127 that is being developed. So it hasn't been, oh, actually, of course, I forgot the MDMA, which is also very interesting. Essentially, FDA admitted that psilocybin has therapeutic potential. It clearly demonstrates therapeutic potential, which goes against the Schedule I premise that it doesn't have therapeutic potential. So in subsequent communication with FDA, they said that they encourage us to submit a plan for rescheduling, how we see the rescheduling, and I understand that the work on that issue has already been done at Hopkins, so it's really good to see that happening. So, lessons learned in our regulatory conversations. So today, this protocol was submitted in 12 different countries. We had ongoing conversations, extensive conversations for the last 18 months with regulators in 12 different countries. We have approvals from clinical trial authorities from 9 different countries. In some countries, we still have to get approvals from central ethics committees, and in some countries, we have full approvals. And this is very encouraging. So I think the main lessons that we've learned in this process, well, I guess I just have to mention that there are 3 countries, Norway, Germany, and Czech Republic. And the regulators in these 3 countries are known for their thoroughness, should I say. And so it's not surprising that we don't have approvals in these countries yet, but it looks like we're moving in that direction. And I think the reason we're moving in that direction is because we continue having conversations. We're actually not discouraged, and we view it as an opportunity to educate regulators. I think it's very important to understand that regulators are people too. And when we have these conversations about treatment-resistant depression and significant unmet need, we do see people in the kind of regulatory, in the regulatory meetings who nod their heads, and they all have, friends and family who are affected by ineffective treatments. So I think once we pass that, us versus them, and don't view them as a hurdle, but have, develop a conversation with them so we can all work together. I think the conversations becomes much easier, and in our experience, relationships are important with regulators or with anybody else with clinical science, just like in real life. So we view it as a very, very important piece of work. So what have we learned in all this, in 18 months of this regulatory conversation? So the first lesson is that there are no political or ideological barriers at all. No one has ever brought up the question that this is an illegal drug, there's no point of studying it. The regulators are interested. I think the most openness we've seen with FDA, Health Canada, UK was remarkably open. I, to some extent, attribute this openness to previous work of MAPS and, in the UK, by work of David Nutt and Robin. So it was not a completely new concept to the regulators. Nevertheless, it's our experience pretty much everywhere. The regulators are motivated to find effective solutions. There was very little concern, essentially no concern about the abuse potential and misuse potential or dependency, just kind of routine questions, and we move on. Another question was about perceived risk. So perceived risk is largely among regulators is informed by scientific evidence, with only anecdotal, anecdotes from media or ethnographic evidence. Someone had had experience with magic mushrooms and hasn't come back. But we could, for the most part, we could manage that. And I think it's very important to have these conversations and to view it as an opportunity so we can continue educating regulators about the risks and benefits of psilocybin. Now, the very important question is drug therapy combination. So it's not entirely new concept, but it's fairly new regulatory concept. The only two other examples that exist in drug therapy combination are namilfin, that's a drug for alcohol abuse that is administered with online therapy. Actually, it's the NICE that pointed us in that direction and encouraged us to look at this model for the future regulatory work. And the other one, in some European countries, SSRIs in adolescents have to be administered in the context of psychotherapy. But those are two kind of not very well known paradigms. So this is an opportunity again to have a conversation with regulators. The other more complex issue with psilocybin, and I think it could be viewed as a challenge or as an opportunity, is the fact that with psilocybin, we actually should embrace the role that subjective experience plays in clinical efficacy. And that is an entirely new concept, entirely new regulatory concept. If we look at the development program of esketamine, you know, the dissociative effects of esketamine were largely, I think the J&J wished it wasn't so, and it was viewed as an adverse event. But based on the research and the ethnographic evidence, we know that subjective experiences play a huge role in the mechanism of change, not just the mechanism of action. And therefore, we need to understand how they fit into the regulatory framework and within the framework of, you know, clinical trial methodology, and to work with the regulators to embrace it, not to ignore it. So this is an opportunity for something that we call regulatory innovation, which could sound like an oxymoron, but regulatory innovation does exist. So the perceived risk, I guess I just need to, I wanted to mention, or maybe I just wanted to brag about this quote from FDA. Again, going back to the perceived risk, that they said that psilocybin appears to be relatively safe, so no need to limit it to the severely ill population, so please expand. So I found it really encouraging. Now, moving on to how do we make psilocybin therapy? Let's say the clinical trials go well. How do we make it available? The rate-limiting factor, of course, will be the availability of well-trained therapists who understand the sensibility of this approach. This is not a small task. For phase 3 clinical trials, we estimated, or the clinical development program leading to phase 3 clinical trials, we estimated that we need 120 well-trained therapists who can actually conduct psilocybin sessions independently. And it's really not a small task. So post-approval, just to meet a fraction of the demand in a very limited population of treatment-resistant depression, we will need about 10,000 therapists, both in Europe and the US and Canada. It's unclear what the credentialing path to professional credentialing for this therapist would be. The conversations in the US have started. Compass participates in a US-based task force with Compass, CIS, and other organizations that will start looking in the path to credentialing of such therapists. Probably, in our opinion, might be different from MAPS and others. In our opinion, the credentialing should be based on the clinical experience that this therapist could or should demonstrate. And the clinical experience is essential. Maybe personal experiences with psychedelics are important. However, there are other challenges with this, which we can discuss if you're interested. So, but the chances are that training requirements and criteria for training and ability to conduct independent psilocybin sessions will be part of REMS, which is risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, which is always a part of the product that is coming out on the market. So the way we think about it is, so currently Compass has a 5-step program that was designed with, not with, but by world experts. At least I consider them experts. It was a huge team that put their work in this. So currently it's shared knowledge platform online training. We call it shared knowledge platform because we don't pretend that we know everything that needs to be done and said in psychedelic sessions. So it's as the trial starts, our therapists log into the platform, and we hope to get a continuous kind of feedback from them from the trenches, because we don't have access to patients according to regulations. So we sort of vicariously try to adjust the methods. So the shared knowledge platform currently is about 20 plus hours of videos, reenactment. It's really not an educational program, it's really a training program, which is different from educational program. So we go over different scenarios that could potentially arise in psychedelic session. Then it's 5-day in-person role play with actors and impersonators of patients. Then exposure, we consider it the most essential step, the exposure of to 4 to 6 different psychedelic experiences. I think it's a minimum that will be required, but potentially it might be more. So we are in conversations with FDA to determine, how much clinical experience therapists should have before they can lead sessions independently. And because this is a rate-limiting step, then this part in the future training needs to be linked to and set up in centers that can predictably, consistently run a reasonable volume of psychedelic psilocybin sessions. So to allow to tie in the training with clinical development program. So at the moment we are in the process of recruiting such sites that could not only be the clinical trial sites, but also the therapist training sites. And the next step is ongoing adherence monitoring and in-person one-on-one mentoring with leading therapists and trainers. And the last step is we do webinars every 4 to 6 weeks, sort of like grand rounds, for those who are familiar with US system of education, where we discuss different cases that might arise either in healthy volunteer study or in TRD trials. So at the moment, we train therapists for this TRD trial at the healthy volunteer study at the at IoP. And I'm hugely grateful to the IoP team, to James and Catherine and everybody else who made the impossible possible. By some miracle, when we started this, we thought, again, how hard could it be? And then, and then the trial, now the study is almost over. We have 4 more sessions to go. And every Thursday, at one of the most respectable institutions in Europe and in the world, every Thursday, 4 to 6 healthy volunteers take psilocybin. We take over the clinical research facility and turn it into a psychedelic type environment with rugs, candles, and 4 to 6 healthy volunteers take psilocybin, different doses, and therapists are being trained. So it's not a small miracle. So that's our program, and that's how we think about training therapists for the next phase of research. And finally, how do we make psilocybin therapy affordable? So this is, I think, the most kind of controversial part. Let's just get my notes here. Make sure I don't miss anything. So I think the first thing I want to make sure that is very clear, and that reimbursement by health systems is absolutely essential. Fee for service is unsustainable and serves a very small proportion of the population. If psilocybin therapy is not reimbursed by health systems or insurers, nothing will change. And the same people who have access to underground therapy right now will continue having access to this, except that therapists and those patients will not go to jail for this. So that's good news, but it's not enough. It's about 100 million patients with treatment-resistant depression alone. So, and majority of patients will not be willing to go underground. Not to mention the cost. The cost of psilocybin session, at least in the US, underground psilocybin session, is between $500 and $5,000 per session for mushrooms that grow free on the windowsill. So that is an opposite of access. So the thinking about reimbursement and integrating psilocybin therapy into health systems is absolutely essential. But reimbursement by national health systems and insurance depends on the quality of data generated in particular trials. And as recent, I don't know if you've seen the paper in JAMA, recent paper in JAMA, that the quality of data generated in clinical trials is directly proportional to the cost of the trial. The higher the cost, the more expensive the trial is, the better the quality of data. Not a good news. And so again, regulatory input is essential. The reason why early regulatory input is essential is because the drug prices in general are driven by, the drug prices absorb all the failures in the pipeline of the drugs that failed before. So, minimizing mistakes that could be prevented by early conversations with regulators is essential to keep the drug prices down and the cost of drug development down. Now, the drug prices also depend on where the treatment comes in the guideline, in the care guidelines. So psilocybin is not a trivial intervention. It requires preparation. It requires establishing therapeutic alliance with the therapist. It requires integration. It's the whole day of, in the US there are 2 therapists. Probably not a sustainable model, but we can think about it. So it requires to think in terms of price. So that because how resource-intense psilocybin treatment is, it will never be the first-line treatment in healthcare systems, at least, or within the framework of reimbursement. So there will always be less expensive, much less expensive antidepressants that people will have to fail before they can have access to psilocybin therapy. So it's important to understand, but our assumption is that psilocybin will come somewhere probably after either augmentation or after a failed CBT or other evidence-based therapies, but probably before somatic therapies. At least it's our assumption, and in that case the psilocybin therapy will be priced somewhere on the level of CBT, which is, I think, reasonable. But how do we, what's the business model, and how do we pay back our investors and yet stay true to our mission of ubiquitous access? It's very difficult to say right now. It all depends on what clinical trials show. It all depends whether the drug really works within clinical trials. It might be that there's a just, personal transformative experiences, and they fail to demonstrate, clinical efficacy within the regulatory standards. So let's assume the drug works. Then, how do we determine the price? And one model that is emerging, so the regulators and payers increasingly are reluctant to pay for input, that is for the number of sessions, and increasingly want to pay for the outcomes. So the value-based reimbursement is an attractive model for the society. And what it means is that the savings that the treatment creates within the certain population segment could be translated and shared between society and the developer. So for example, if psilocybin demonstrates that it has superior potential to induce remission. Remission is worth to society and health systems much more than simply response. People who remit in general have better outcomes. So that kind of understanding again informs the health, the design of the trials and the thinking. But again, it's very important to start these conversations with payers and early on. So we had conversations with we started having conversations with a couple of big insurers in the US. And I have to say that people are fascinated by the evidence and by the promise. And I think, again, just like with regulators, there are no barriers. We've seen the quote from NICE. And as you know, NICE informs the guidelines, informs the NHS whether to reimburse intervention or not. Again, we need to understand what exactly they want to see and include these metrics into clinical trials. So the pricing, drug pricing, is not a simple math model. It doesn't mean that that's what it's worth to society and that's what it costs us and that let's divide it and declare a victory. It's actually a very complex modeling. There are PhDs in drug pricing. And it's important to, the less assumptions we make in modeling, the more precise the model is, and the more precise the drug pricing strategy is. And so again, it's important to inform the clinical trials by the understanding of what insurers and payers want to see. I hope it's not too much for you. So, okay, that's the end. So again, as a result, as a kind of the end to our conversation, the mission drives strategy. I think it's very important to ask yourself what it is that you're trying to do. And our mission is to, so I guess in terms of strategy, if you integrating psychedelics into society is a very different mission from integrating psychedelic therapy into health systems. So our goal is much more modest than to integrate psychedelics into society. And it requires different strategy, different streams of funding, different models, and different skills. These two models, in my opinion, can coexist and inform each other, and should coexist and inform each other. I do believe that one tide lifts all the boats. I think the safety data generated in clinical trials could be used to benefit everyone and to change public perception, which is not a small task. But in general, eventually you have to change. You have to choose your strategy. You have to choose your goals and execute in a sober, pragmatic way, keeping in mind and measuring your success by number of lives of patients and their families that suffer and affected by the lack of effective treatments. And psilocybin holds the promise that we can no longer ignore. Thank you.